So, guys, we learned about the Allied invasion of France um, yesterday and how the British and the Americans came across and landed at Normandy and started pushing towards Germany. Okay, at this very same time, Stalin over here in the Soviet Union, he is sending his forces pushing towards Germany. So, what we're going to have here is when the Eastern Front meets the Western Front, we're going to have us a Hitler sandwich right up here in Berlin as these two fronts are going to meet up. And it's exactly what Adolf Hitler did not want to happen. So I said that, remember, June 6, 1944, we invaded Normandy and we started pushing towards Germany. Well, Germany got a little nervous, and they certainly did not want thousands of Allied troops invading their country. So they are going to have a massive pushback. Okay. And this is going to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Some of you may have heard of this before. And the reason why it's called the Battle of the Bulge is because Germany is going to be pushing into the lines here, and it's going to create a bulge in the line. So, like you can see, this is the German flags right here, the Nazi flags. They're going to push our troops back, and it surrounds the city of Bastogne in Belgium. And there's some pretty cool, not cool, it was a terrible battle. But we're going to talk about the Battle of the Bulge, and that is your first term for today. As you can see, it was December 1944 to January 1945, and so the Americans had landed in June, and so it's December, so it's taken several months to get to the German line, but Germany's going to push back, okay? Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge the greatest American battle of the war. And the Battle of the Bulge took place in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, the Ardennes region. And Ardennes is spelled Ardennes. Ardennes. Okay. And this would be Germany's last major offensive in World War II, their last ditch attempt to try to get a victory. And you can see again here, Germany created a bulge in our line as we were trying to push into Germany. They were hoping to divide our troops up. But ultimately, even though it set America back about a month, it was about 6 weeks of brutal fighting, Germany is going to lose. Okay. So basically, this battle was pretty hard on America. It was very costly for the U.S. Army. We had over 100,000 casualties. And basically, this has made a timestamp on our history. And Bastogne, which is right here in the center. You can see that actually at one time the Nazis had the city of Bastogne surrounded, and inside Bastogne was the 101st Airborne Division. And make sure that you spell Bastogne correctly, Bastogne. And basically, the images that come out of the Battle of the Bulge look like a tornado just wrecked an entire forest. It was intense fighting down in these foxholes, and it was extremely wintry, and some of the conditions were extremely terrible. Hitler attacked in December, so you can imagine how cold that was. There was freezing rain, there was fog, deep snow drifts. They had record-breaking low temperatures. So I feel for these men that fought over here. I'm going to show you just some pictures. Almost all of the pictures are of our troops just embedded in these huge snow drifts. Thousands of our soldiers succumbed to cold injuries like pneumonia and frostbite and so forth. Truly terrible. The Nazis were, like I said, at this point when we were so close to Germany, they were doing everything that they could to attempt to infiltrate our troops. They sent imposters that could speak very good English, and they put them in like British uniforms, and they would basically go and change road signs, and it was just terrible. There was a lot of Nazis dressed like American soldiers, and they just were trying to, spread misinformation. They were carefully groomed for this mission. Um, Basically, it was absolutely, they call Battle of Bastogne or the Battle of the Bulge extremely, just, it was like hell on earth. And the weather was so bad, it wasn't until Christmas Day, 1944, that the weather finally cleared, allowing just the Air Force to use strikes from up above. And it was actually on Christmas morning, 1944, that like the Air Force and the tanks could finally maneuver and get assistance to the 101st Airborne, who were completely blocked off. Eisenhower, again, was the Supreme Allied Commander. And also, you can't talk about the Battle of the Bulge without talking about Lieutenant General Patton. General Patton led the American defense to try to, get back at the front and try to push the Germans back. And Eisenhower gave Patton about 230,000 soldiers and said, "Look, get over there, get into the Bulge and do some work." And in this small town of Bastogne, which is in Belgium, the Germans had surrounded thousands of our troops. And Eisenhower is trying to get, more units in there to help the 101st Airborne, and they're famous because of this event. And it's kind of cool. I've got a personal connection to this particular story. So here's just another picture of these soldiers in this freezing temperatures and so forth. Like, look at that. Oh my gosh, I just feel for these men that are out there day in and day out fighting in these horrible conditions. So this is General Anthony McAuliffe, and he was in command of those U.S. 101st Airborne troops that were in Bastogne. And the Germans sent him a message on December 22nd. And they basically said, "You need to surrender your troops." And Anthony McAuliffe, this lieutenant general, or he was a brigadier general at the time, he sent them a response back that has made him famous in history. He's been in movies, people have portrayed him, and I will let you read what he said to the Germans. So this is the Germans speaking to McAuliffe, who's surrounded. They said, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river Orth, near Orthville, have taken Marsh, and reached St. Hubert by passing through Hombre Cypre Tille. Liebrand is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled U.S. troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, the German Artillery Corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the U.S. troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity." So Germany's like, "Look, lots of civilians are going to die, and it's going to be on you because you did not surrender." So General McAuliffe, here's what he says back. The German commander received the following reply to the German commander: "Nuts, the American commander." And so General McAuliffe is famous for when the Germans asked him to surrender at Bastogne, he responds back with one word: "Nuts." And they're like, what in the world? They were like, that was just so funny. And it made him super famous. He's known as General Anthony Nuts McAuliffe now in history. And actually, the Germans kind of, interpreted that as basically not good, and essentially it meant kind of go to hell, we're not going to surrender. And then the day after Christmas, so just a few days after this telegram back and forth between the lines. General Patton's unit approaches, and basically breaks through the German lines and rescues our troops. And so it's really awesome. But on Christmas, McAuliffe wrote this message to his troops, and he said this: Merry Christmas. What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home. All true. But what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades, the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and all the rest? Just this. We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, south, east, and west. We have identifications from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were headed straight west for key points when the Eagle Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. How effectively this was done will be written in history, not alone in our division's glorious history, but in world history. The Germans actually did surround us. Their radios blared our doom. Their commander demanded our surrender in the following imprudent arrogance. December 22nd, 1944. Or actually, that was the next letter, but December 24th, 1944. He wrote that on Christmas Eve. So General Anthony Nuts McAuliffe ended up standing up to the Germans, and it was kind of a very famous part of U.S. history. And where I said that I have a personal connection to is that my grandfather, who is right there, that's my dad's dad, he enlisted in the military and went off and served in the Pacific. And then when the war was over, he returned to the United States and was assigned to be General Anthony McAuliffe's private secretary, his personal secretary at the Pentagon. And my grandfather worked for him for several months before deciding to return back home to my hometown where I grew up. And he married my grandmother, and they were married for over, 70 years, I guess. And he just passed away last fall. So he was 93 years old. So he got to be working in the Pentagon with General McAuliffe. So that's really cool. All right, you guys. So let's wrap up Battle of the Bulge here. I said Patton's army came and rescued McAuliffe and the circled 101st. And basically, they got their victory and they continued heading for Berlin. And what's neat is that the war ends basically in 5 months because Germany is going to surrender. And so, according to the U.S. Department of Defense, 1 million plus Allied troops, which includes 500,000 Americans, fought in the Battle of the Bulge. 19,000 soldiers were killed in action. 47,000 were wounded. And then 100,000 Germans were killed or wounded. Okay. And the Battle of the Bulge was just an extremely challenging part of our history, but it basically broke the back of the Nazi war machine and allowed us to push on into Germany. Okay. And today, if you go to Bastogne, they have a tribute to General McAuliffe there in their city square. It's really cool. Okay, so we're going to watch this short video and just to recap what I taught you.
The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944 through January 25, 1945, the Ardennes. Following the successful Normandy landings in June 1944 and the various landings in southern France, the Allied powers advanced quickly through France, faster than what the military leadership of both the Allies and Germany had anticipated. Due to this, the Allied troops were suffering from fatigue from weeks of combat. Supplies were dangerously low, and the supply lines themselves were extremely thin. Hitler decided that if the German army could quickly attack through the Belgian Ardennes forest, a weak, quiet part in the Allied line, occupied by battle-weary units, and capture the Allies' supply port of Antwerp, he could split the Allied front in two. As a result of this, Hitler could make a separate peace with Britain and the USA, rather than unconditional surrender and focus on Soviet Russia. This was all fantasy, and his commanders were not optimistic the offensive would go ahead. After a 2-hour artillery bombardment on the Allied lines, the attack, comprising of 200,000 German troops and almost 1,000 tanks of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies and the 7th Army, began on the American forces on December 16, 1944. The German forces achieved complete surprise on the outnumbered American troops. Special forces caused confusion by sending in English-speaking German soldiers dressed up in U.S. uniforms who changed road signs and cut telephone wires. The bad weather for the moment was also too cloudy and foggy, which meant that the might of the Allied Air Force could not be used. Many U.S. units became overrun or had to surrender. Those that were not established a defense around road junctions at Saint-Vith and Bastogne. The difficult terrain of the Ardennes made a large-scale offensive unexpected, so it would take a while for the Allied High Command to accept that this was a major attack. While the Germans did see some success in the center, the Northern 6th Panzer Army's advance stalled within a few days. On December 18th, the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded by the Germans at Bastogne. Cold, starved, outnumbered, and low on ammunition, the 101st would hold out for 7 days against the German assault. On Christmas Eve, some German troops almost reached the River Meuse, but with little fuel, the German advance had reached its peak. On December 26th, General Patton's Third Army, which had completely turned around from its advance, relieved the 101st at Bastogne. The German resupply difficulties had grown, and the skies had cleared, allowing the Allied air power the ability to target German forces. The German blitzkrieg tactics also couldn't work in the heavily wooded, snowy forests, deep valleys, and narrow roads of the Ardennes. Even heavily armored vehicles such as the Germans' Tiger II heavy tank could not turn the tide because it consumed huge amounts of fuel. The U.S. forces began a counteroffensive on January 3rd. By this point, the German Panzer Division was so low on fuel, they abandoned a lot of their tanks. The U.S. counteroffensive regained all land lost during the German offensive by late January. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle fought by the Americans in World War II. Due to deep snow, cold temperatures, bad weather, and dwindling fuel reserves, the German Army and Air Force were unable to launch the crushing blow to the Allies Hitler had hoped for. While the attack is known as the Ardennes Offensive, the initial attack by the Germans created a triangular bulge that stretched for miles into the Allied front line, creating the commonly known name of Battle of the Bulge. The Americans suffered around 80,000 casualties, while the Germans had 100,000 casualties, and most of the tanks used in the offensive, which could not be replaced. Subscribe for more World War II videos. Get your copy of Simple History World War II today.
Oh, wow. That took me where I didn't want to go. Okay, back to this. Oh, bless America. Never hit the back button in the browser, right? I'm close. Okay. All right. So that was the Battle of the Bulge. Hope you got that. And you got General McAuliffe written down. Now we're going to transition to Stalingrad. And chronologically, it doesn't fit into what we've been learning, but we're going to talk about the Eastern Front now. We talked about the war in the Pacific, we talked about the war in Europe, and now we're going to kind of talk about over in Eurasia, or whatever we want to call Russia or the Soviet Union. Okay, so if you look at the map here, this is Europe, 1939. You can see that this encircled town here is Stalingrad. Okay, here's Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. Here's Leningrad. All of these are key areas of World War II fighting in Russia. Stalingrad, of course, is the namesake of Joseph Stalin, and it's going to be the scene of a massive battle during World War II. And factually, remember that Adolf Hitler reached out to Joseph Stalin before he attacked Poland back in 1939 in August, and he said, hey, let's sign a treaty saying we won't attack each other for 10 years. Well, that didn't last very long, because a year and a half later, Adolf Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Okay. And the fighting between the Soviet Union and Germany was extremely intense. Adolf Hitler sends 3 million German troops to invade the Soviet Union. I mean, think how large of a landmass it is. if you've ever seen The Princess Bride, I mean, they were right by saying never get involved in a land war in Asia. Um, and so, anyways, that's just a little Princess Bride humor for you. And so in 1942, Adolf Hitler sent his troops to take Stalingrad, located pretty far inside Russia. And Stalingrad is often considered as the single largest and bloodiest battle in the history of warfare. The battle itself was many months long, 5 or 6 months long. August to February. What would that be? August, September, October, December. So yeah, 6 months long or so. And basically, Hitler would not let his men retreat. Stalin would not let his men retreat. And it's an incredible battle story in Stalingrad. And just like the Battle of the Bulge, you guys, this was fought in Russia during the winter. Okay. And so the pictures of it are horrible as well. Very cold, very brutal. And so let's talk about the Battle of Stalingrad. So we'll say August of 42 to February of 43, and more than 2 million troops fought, some in hand-to-hand combat. And honestly, the Battle of Stalingrad is pretty awesome because Stalin actually defeats Hitler and has the German army on the run. And so this is considered the turning point of World War II. Just like in the war in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway, it was considered the turning point of the war in the Pacific. The Battle of Stalingrad is considered the turning point in the war. And anytime you hear a turning point in history, that means something big is going to happen. Okay? And so, okay. When you hear the word Wehrmacht, that's the German military, the Wehrmacht soldiers, in case you ever hear that. In German, the W's are pronounced with a V, the Wehrmacht. So Adolf Hitler's military was the Wehrmacht. So you're going to hear that in the video here in just a second. But Hitler wanted the Wehrmacht to occupy Stalingrad. It had lots of value, given that it bore Stalin's name, and also it was a industrial center in Russia, and it produced lots of their goods and artillery for the country's troops. The Volga River ran right through the city, and so that was a really important shipping route for the Soviets. And so Hitler proclaimed that when the soldiers take Stalingrad, that they need to kill all the city's male residents, and all of the women are going to be deported. And so Stalin ordered all these Russians, even if you weren't really trained, take up a rifle and take up defense of our city. And so the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht began their assault August of 1942. And basically, the Russian forces were able to slow the German advance just north of Stalingrad, but Stalin lost 200,000 men, but they did hold off the Germans. But within a few days, the Air Force of Germany, the Luftwaffe, had basically bombed the Volga River, making it like impassable to shipping. And they had sunk many Russian vessels that were on the Volga River. And so the Luftwaffe continued to just do dozens of airstrikes on Stalingrad. And the number of civilian casualties is unknown because that was a city where people were living. Tens of thousands were killed. And many were actually captured and sent into these slave camps in Germany. So basically, things were getting extremely desperate. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Stalingrad, and basically, women were being called to dig trenches at the front lines, and the Russians continued to suffer heavy losses. Like I read an article that said basically your life expectancy on the front line at Stalingrad was less than like a minute. And so heavy casualties were occurring. And Stalin basically issues this Order 227, which is one of your terms, that basically said not one step back. Like his troops were not allowed to take a step back. Those who surrendered would be subject to a trial by a military tribunal and face execution. Things were so bad, Stalin could not have his soldiers or his volunteers even taking one step back. Wow. And so basically, the Germans are going to get essentially stuck inside Stalingrad. And so the Russians are going to put this huge defensive ring around their city, trapping about 300,000 Germans in the Sixth Army. And so it's kind of cool that they essentially encircled their own city and they cut off the supply lines. And the German forces in Stalingrad slowly began to just starve. And so the Russians were seized upon this weakness because the cold weather set in and they were not prepared like the Russians were. And so the Soviet generals knew that the winter would be a huge disadvantage because the Nazis were fighting in conditions that they were not accustomed to. And so basically, they began to kind of squeeze in and kind of tightening up the noose on the German soldiers. And at this point, the German generals, they were like, we want to surrender. And so they got word to Adolf Hitler. Hitler refused to let his men surrender, even as they starved and ran out of ammunition. And so Hitler's general was General von Paulus. And he wrote to Hitler, and Hitler wrote back and he said this: surrender is forbidden. Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man in the last round. By this time, temperatures were below zero, food and ammunition was short, people had lost fingers and toes and lives. 91,000 Germans had been taken as prisoners of war. Hitler was ticked. And so essentially, this battle is going to end. And so basically, the Russians capture the German soldiers, and the loss of Stalingrad was the first failure of the war, essentially, that Hitler had to claim. And essentially, Adolf Hitler was so ashamed that he ordered a day of mourning, not for the 850,000 Germans that had died at Stalingrad, but for the shame that General von Paulus had brought upon the country of Germany. He was stripped of his rank, and it was absolutely terrible. But Stalingrad was a very famous battle during World War II on the Russian front. And so now Stalin is starting to push towards Germany. Okay. And as the Germans are retreating back to Germany, there's going to be another battle. Russia also followed Stalingrad with a tank victory at a town called Kursk, Kursk. And if you know World War II history, you know Kursk. But apparently it's the largest tank battle in the history of the world. The Germans had something like 2,400 tanks. The Soviets had 3,600 tanks engaging each other on the battlefield. You can look up the Battle of Kursk. Oops. Oh my goodness. I set that timer because Rafe has a Google Meet. Let me go tell him. I'm going to pause this for a second, y'all. Can I do that? I can do that, right? Okay, I guess we're back now. Is it recording? Yes. And I just found out my son decided to go for a bike ride instead of going to his teacher's Google Meet. Isn't that convenient? How frustrating. Anyways, so Battle of Stalingrad, super, super famous World War II battle that you need to be familiar with. The code name of this particular battle, just like every one, is Operation Barbarossa, is this code name for Stalingrad. Okay. And we'll watch this video to get more smart about it.
Battle of Stalingrad, August 23rd, 1942 to February 2nd, 1943. As the Germans advanced towards Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the war came to the locals of the city, and evacuation was slow to the speed of the Wehrmacht's advancement. Because the city bore Stalin's name, it was of high importance for the morale of the Soviet forces to hold it. The desperation for Soviet resistance to the German advance was clear. Work frantically continued in the weapon factories. T-34 tanks could be seen rushed into battle, unpainted, and sometimes lacking gun sights. Men not already in the Red Army were formed into militia and sent into battle, sometimes without proper training and with high casualties. Women and children dug trenches and built protective fortifications, but would also fight as machine gunners in gun crews. and as scouts and snipers. On the 12th of September, the first German troops moved into the city. They chose to attack straight into the urban area and soon found themselves in brutal, close-quarters, house-to-house battles. The Soviets established frontline positions as close as possible to the German lines, which was the safest place from German air and artillery attacks. In August, Stalin had sent his top general, Georgy Zhukov, to supervise the whole southern front, and Vasily Chuikov took over the 62nd Army in the city. While Zhukov prepared for a counteroffensive, Chuikov pushed his troops into combat. When asked how he interpreted his task, he responded, "We will defend the city or die in the attempt." Reinforcements were ferried under fire across the Volga into the ruins, with enough troops making it to the other side to keep at least part of the city in Soviet hands. Soviet casualties were immensely high, but German casualties were mounting as well. To ensure the defense of Stalingrad, Stalin had issued Order Number 227 on July 27, 1942, known as "Not One Step Backwards." Armies were formed with a second line of barrier troops behind them who acted as a last line of defense. Officers and soldiers who deserted could also be sent to penal battalions, which was a virtual death sentence. Red Army troops built a maze of trenches in damaged buildings and used the sewer system to sneak past the enemy. Both sides employed snipers, and the destroyed buildings of Stalingrad made it an ideal environment for cover. The most famous Soviet sniper celebrated as a hero was Vasily Zaitsev, with 225 confirmed kills. At the end of September and in mid-October, the Germans came close to victory, but the defenders clung onto part of the city's northern factory district. The advance to Stalingrad brought other problems for the Axis forces. Hitler had fired several of his generals in the summer after arguments over his strategic plan. Now he was making many command decisions himself. The winter caused problems for both sides, breaking down tanks and making weapons more difficult to operate. However, the Red Army had better clothing for the freezing cold conditions, with quilted jackets and fur hats. Stalingrad had expanded the German front, and as a consequence, the Italian and Romanian armies were brought in to support the flanks of the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army. Fighting inside Stalingrad was sapping German forces and causing them to pull units from flanks into the city. The Romanian and Italian troops were poorly trained and had low morale. Therefore, they would be the first targets for the planned Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviets attacked Hungarian positions north of Stalingrad on November 19th, and to the south the next day, devastating the Romanian fronts. Within a week, the two advancing Red Army forces had joined up and cut Stalingrad off. General Paulus asked permission to break out, which he could have done, but Hitler refused, instead promising to resupply the trapped German army by air. General Erich von Manstein was brought in to lead a relief attempt for the surrounded pocket, but had to retreat before Christmas. The air supply effort also cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of transport aircraft and only managed to deliver a fraction of its supplies. Now short of fuel, food, and ammunition, the German 6th Army now faced superior forces all around them. The last German troops in the city would surrender on February 2nd, 1943, but sporadic fighting around the city went on until March. The Battle of Stalingrad was a crushing blow to Nazi Germany, and the losses to the Wehrmacht could not adequately be replaced.
Subscribe to see more history videos. Get Simple History.
Okay. Hope I forget how I get back without doing that, y'all. I don't know why. Okay, yeah. So anyway, Stalingrad and Battle of the Bulge were your two lessons for today. It's crazy how just a few terms can take so long because there's such long explanations. Okay, well, we are going to next week talk about Japanese internment and talk about kind of the war front on the home front for America, and then we'll wrap it up with the atomic bomb ending the war. So I hope you guys have learned a lot. I haven't heard from many of you. The only time I hear from you is if you're having technological problems. I'd love to hear from you more. Anyways, have a good day. Talk to you later.